Hi, I'm Andrew Foster, a clinical professor here at Duke Law School. I'm so pleased to be joined today by Cameron Smith. Cameron is a founding member of Communities in Partnership, a grassroots organizing and education group based in Old East Durham. Cameron currently serves as the executive director of CIP, and she comes to that work with more than 18 years of experience in place-based development, both in the US and abroad. Cameron, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Maybe a good place to start is just with the real basics. I know that CIP was founded in 2011. You've been doing a lot of work in Durham for the last decade. Can you tell us a little bit about what CIP is and what it does?
Communities in Partnership started off as basically a collaboration of residents that live in specifically the Old East Durham community located in Northeast Central Durham. We were brought together by some unfortunate instances. There was a shooting that took place in our community and it traumatized some families with young children and also a gentleman that was walking down the street. And so we came together to actually to talk about the events that actually led up to the shooting. And we really, after we started talking and conferring with each other, we saw that we could have stopped, probably if we had actually been communicating as neighbors, could have prevented that from happening. And so the powers that be, or larger scale nonprofits, came together with the police and offered what they thought was a good way of keeping it from happening again, which was boarding up our windows, boarding up our front doors, running to and from our cars, and not allowing our children to play in the yard. And we thought that was a wholly incomplete response because we live in a neighborhood and not a war zone. And so we came together as a community off of an initial dinner that was catered. And then one of our community elders stood up and stated that catering a meal is not sustainable for poor folk. And so how about us just having a good old fashioned potluck? And so we began in February of 2012. We had a potluck every month, just about every month, up until September of 2019. And so we were meeting every month, breaking bread together, sharing, building relationships. Out of that came block parties, they came neighborhood cleanups, all sorts of wonderful feel goods. We have trunk or treats with maps and everything, luminaries all over the neighborhood. And so about 6 to 7 years ago, people started complaining that their leases weren't being renewed, that the landlords were not actually doing any of the infrastructure, the upgrades to the housing to make it safe and habitable. At that point, we're having issues also with food access and food sovereignty issues with folks, because CIP was organized and founded by the folks in the community, the board of directors, and the folks actually doing the work or who are accountable for representing CIP were those very same people. And so at that point in time, the board had appointed me as executive director and gave me kind of oversight over what we were trying to do. And so one of the founding board members who was struggling with food insecurity themselves came up with a wonderful idea of actually building a food co-op. And so that's when we launched we became a nonprofit, a 501c3. Then of course we needed services like what you offer, Andrew, and filed for a 501c3 designation, started fundraising and building a cooperative model that was hugely based at the beginning in charity, but part of our ideology is to use charity as a tool to leverage access for developmental strategies for people who are dealing with issues surrounding racial injustice, systemic inequality, and poverty. And so that's what we do. We have everything that we do is rooted in how do we meet people's felt need immediately, while also trying to pivot and build capacity so that those systems can be self-sustained and owned and be a space for people who've been directly impacted to learn and grow and to take ownership of those spaces.
There's so much there, we could talk for 3 days probably, but let me just pull off one word that you mentioned, which is rooted, because you and some co-authors have written this really wonderful piece that was published in Metropolitics that defines CIP as a community-rooted organization and really distinguishes that from community-based, which is what so many of the nonprofits that many of us engage with. Can you just talk about that distinction and why being community-rooted matters so much?
So part of the reason we found a need to actually delineate, because there's large scale nonprofits in the community that actually for good, bad, or indifferent, were kind of co-opting our work a little bit,
Mm,
and people were getting confused with what we do and what they do. And so they were receiving large amounts of funding, had massive infrastructures, had resources that we as a little small resident-led organization did not have. And up until we really started funding the co-op back in when we launched it in 2017, everything that we had done before that point had come pretty much, so the vast majority of it, 90 to 95+%, was by the people who formulated, who were the founding team members or the board members of communities and partnerships. So we were all contributing out of our own back pockets to actually do things like the trunk or treat, to do things like the neighborhood block parties and things of that nature. We did do a little bit of fundraising just to see, to offer, people would drop off bags of candy or donate hot dogs and hamburgers if they
mm,
wanted to for the block party. Generally speaking, outside of that, we were funding a lot of the events for ourselves, and also that also meant funding when people had needs. We were funding those ourselves. So what we wanted to do is delineate what community rooted versus community based organizations were, so that we could actually have a way to actually communicate who we were, and for
mhm.
people to understand that our organization is rooted in the community. It's run by, it's accountable to, it operates in perspective of what's directly beneficial to the people that have been the most directly impacted. And so while I am a person of middle class means, I still live in the community. So any decisions that we make, not only do my neighbors feel it, but I feel it too. And also my relationships actually are impacted by the decisions that I make, as well as our board. Our board is all directly impacted folk, with the exception of one person. Um, and so that's part of the methodology or the ideology behind it, rooting it as close to the proximity of impact as possible, so the decisions that you make are reflective and are representative of what people in the community want, need, and how they can actually build their own sustainability and autonomy.
When you were telling us about how CIP started, you talked about kind of the organic community response to this shooting, and kind of it sounded like maybe people from the city or the police department and other existing organizations coming up with solutions that really involved you, stopping to live a life the way it should be lived, right? And
Exactly.
boarding your windows, running to your cars. And I think,
Hmm.
one of the things in my experience working with you and working with CIP that again maybe comes out of this being community rooted, but I'd love to hear you talk about is your willingness to really talk about kind of power and hierarchy in society, and why it's so important to reorganize power.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what the question is in there, but I mean, does
Yeah.
that feel like something that is different about CIP to you?
So we do think it's important for us to name and recognize power. And part of the inception of CIP is we were um, actually able to benefit from a lot of the training and relationship with one of our community elders who's gone on, actually Cynthia Brown with
Mm,
DR Works and
yeah.
with Resourceful Communities, really taught us what community based participation really looks like, and introduced the methodology by Dr. Sherry Arnstein, who wrote. Who actually formulated the ladder of citizen participation. And so from that framework, we based the work that we were doing moving forward, which was shortly after we formulated just the loose kind of relationship organization of CIP back in 2012, 2013. So all of our founding documents, Cynthia was able to help us walk through a process as to how we wanted to be formed, and how we did not want to formulate necessarily a hierarchical structure um, that could follow the same old rubric of the nonprofit industrial complex, but why it's important for us in the way that we organize our organization, how we need to be accountable to people that we make the decisions on behalf of, how we need to be engaging with them, how they need to basically give us the blueprint, and how we can move forward as a collective. But also in that structure, also looking at why communities like ours exist. There's an intentionality and a
Hmm.
history behind the reasons why communities have been intentionally divested from, and it falls across racial lines. And so talking about that and naming that and understanding that when we do sit at the table with hierarchical organizations or more powerful organizations, if we're not actually looking at how we can actually create or benefit or build capacity for our own systems, then that power play and the same level of negative disproportionality either stays the same or it increases. So we're always looking at power, how we actually can transfer that power from organizations, from massive power brokers to our community, and in terms of CIP, and then CIP, how can we transfer that power back to the community?
We're just about a year into COVID now, and um, I mean, hopefully, we all recognize that this pandemic has hit communities very differently based on economics, race, class, geography, um, and so you know I think around these ideas of power and solutions coming from the community. I know you've done an incredible amount of work with the food co-op to address the
Mhm.
hunger crisis that has emerged. Um, but yeah, just I'd be curious if you could describe how has the pandemic affected Old East Durham and Northeast Central Durham, the community that you live in.
Mhm.
What's CIP done, and what do you think has really been successful? Because I can imagine, especially for an organizing an education group where being proximate and those personal
Mhm.
relationships are so important, to have to be socially distant and
Yep.
virtual. I mean, it's
Mhm.
incredible that you're able to persist. So yeah, I'd love to hear how it's been for you.
We literally overnight at the beginning of COVID, we had between 300 and 350 households that were members of the co-op. Literally overnight, within a month or two, that number doubled, almost more than doubled, with people that were needing to have access to the food co-op. And so what we did was we increased our amount of spending and output that we had to actually go into fresh and locally sourced healthy food. And we actually increased that because we're trying to create a system at the same time of the access point of where we actually get that fresh and local food. We wanted it to be very intentional about putting money back into food systems that were owned by BIPOC folks. So during COVID, we were able to increase the farmers that we actually purchase our fresh and locally grown food from somewhere around 15 to 20% to over 84% of our food now is actually sourced by BIPOC, specifically Black and Indigenous farmers who are locally and regionally in this community. And so with that, we had to increase to not to from once a month of the co-op to every other week of the co-op for up until December of last year. We were having a co-op for people to be able to come and supplement their food every other week, which was a big undertaking. So we had to increase the number of staff that was on. We also have had an influx, but pre-COVID, we had around anywhere between 3 to 5% of the folks that were a part of the co-op were Latinx community members.
Mhm.
Overnight, that dramatically increased to around 25 to 30% of our co-op participants were from the Latinx community. So that means I had to hire Latinx community members to help staff and help run the co-op. And so we've had to really just broaden who and what we are, which is something that we wanted to do anyway. COVID just gave us quote unquote it's a bad way, but it gave us an excuse, or it
Mhm.
pushed us to do what we wanted to do, and gave us some of what we needed to do to move in that direction in the first place. And so we've had to do that. And in addition, with our housing, we have quite a few folks. We own multifamily housing in our community, and so with that, we had certain participants in our housing, or certain folks in our housing, who were having difficulties paying even the rents that we had, which were far below market value, because just people's incomes had not risen with the burgeoning boom of Durham.
Right.
But since COVID, we've had to be very flexible, and we've been grateful for our partnership with organizations like Self Help to help us leverage and give people a moratorium. And of course, we are committed to not displacing people, because that's who we are and part of our organization. But it has been a struggle and a learning curve for us in terms of the work that we're doing. COVID has just basically highlighted and shined a huge beam light on the disparities and already the gaps and the holes that were already there in the system that so many people fall through. And so the good thing about COVID is now there's more people more aware. But the thing is, we have to talk about what we're going to do, about how we're going to operationalize that and actually build a bridge that people can actually come from where they are currently to a more thriving, sustainable existence.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a huge challenge, and you're already doing so much work. And how, what this kind of work is it can be incredibly rewarding, obviously, and I can't even imagine how proud you and everyone involved in CIP has to be for all that you've accomplished, but especially this last year,
Mhm.
to be able to address the hunger needs for 700 people, 700 families in the neighborhood, to help keep people in their homes as renters. I mean, just incredible work, but incredibly hard too. So what sustains you? What calls you to this work and what sustains you in it?
We do center the experiences of people who are descendants of formerly enslaved African peoples. And so I want to see my people in my community thrive. I want folks to have the same access or even more than what I've been able to enjoy as a marginalized middle class Black woman. I guess I could say it like that. But to be honest with you, because on a lot of in terms of access and resources and overall cumulative wealth, I don't have the same thing that my white counterparts have. And so but at the same token, there's folks in my neighborhood that if I was the average, we would be in a much better situation. And so, how do we bring people to at least to that point and move beyond that? That's what helps sustain me in this work. And also initiatives that we've created, like the Thriving Communities Fund, which was born out of the unfortunate realities of COVID, specifically for BIPOC entrepreneurs, in terms of we've lost over 25% of Black-owned businesses during COVID in the Durham community. It's not great, and that was a statistic that I was actually exposed to back in the fall, and I'm wondering if it's even higher now.
Yeah.
And and having resources to be able to help bridge, especially those that are committed to equity, that are committed to anti-oppression in terms of the systems that they create in their business and in their community. How can we support them and bridge that funding so that they can either stay open or actually come back online again and start their business again. We also have the Culinary Femme Collective, which is an awesome group of BIPOC, femme, and women identifying folk that are in food-based entrepreneurs that are actually recreating the narrative and are engaged in cooperative wealth building strategies that aren't predicated on a lot of the systems, a lot of the oppression that's related to food systems, in terms of farmers, in terms of the migrant farm worker community, things of that nature, not getting caught up in that. And how do we build a more circular economy? And so work like that, as well as our community rooted trainings that we engage with folks nationally on, NGOs and private organizations and foundations to help them understand how we do this work from a community rooted strategy. How do you identify community rooted organizations so that they can help those organizations build capacity so that you have more sustainable, deeply rooted uh, outcomes that are more impactful, that produce more ownership and the transference of power for BIPOC communities. So all of that stuff, it gets me going, and I'm really excited about the work that we're doing and moving forward with a lot of awesome people like yourself, Andrew. We just really appreciate the work that the Duke Legal Clinic has helped us in so many regards in getting this work done, because there's always compliance issues and legal issues that we have to jump through. So I really appreciate all that you guys have done for and helping us and walking alongside of us. It's definitely been a reciprocal learning process. I will say that. It's been awesome.
Well, that is incredibly kind of you to say, and the law obviously doesn't make it easy to do non-hierarchical,
Yep.
power disrupting work that really promotes equity. So we're glad to have a little bit of role in what you do. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk, and even more, obviously. Thank you for modeling what a new kind of place-based development could look like. As we all try to figure out how do we do a better job of moving towards equity. So thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Andrew. Thank you.